If you're here live, then drop your comments down below and your questions, and I will come to them. Привit, my name is Connor Klein, and greetings from Odessa, Mama, on the shores of the Black Sea. This past week was noteworthy with the Munich Security Conference. If you think back a year ago, we had J.D. Vance with his, I guess, landmark or watershed speech at last year's event, where basically he scolded the European NATO allies of the US and basically claimed that they were the enemy, quote unquote, and not Russia and China, which was quite remarkable. This year we had Marco Rubio come and was basically a polite version of the same refrain. It was a bit different in terms of his speech. It seemed to try to call to a common civilization, although it seemed to frame that civilization in terms of the world order pre-Second World War and imperialism, rather than the shared values from, say, the post-1945 era when we had the Cold War, and that is the origins of the NATO alliance. So quite an unusual speech, and I guess the main takeaway was that it basically was the continuation of what we've seen under the Trump administration since it's now about 13 months in terms of a rupture between the US and its European allies, especially ideologically, and in particular when in the national security strategy, where it was outlined basically that European allies are considered more of a rival to be dealt with than China and Russia, which are historically more of adversarial to the US than Europe and Germany, France, etc., United Kingdom. So that continued on in pretty much the same frame, but a polite version of it. Marco Rubio isn't considered like a hardcore MAGA. He's more of an opportunist in terms of his previous philosophy and politics, in particular respect to Russia, which obviously when we're dealing with the Russo-Ukrainian war, he has been throughout his career a hawk on Russia more than, say, a J.D. Vance or a Stephen Miller, who seem particularly warm towards the Kremlin in a historic perspective with the United States. So that was something that happened this week. I guess in general, even though there isn't that much in terms of optimism about a reconciliation between the United States and Europe, at least things didn't get any worse with this year's Munich Security Conference speeches. It's only a month ago that the US was threatening to invade one of the European allies, Denmark, and the territory of Greenland, and that invasion was deterred. So I guess we should be at least happy that things haven't gotten worse in the last month or so. So normally in these live streams, I emphasize what's going to happen in the next week, but it's basically same of the same old. There are going to be some, in my opinion, at least completely waste of time negotiations, trilateral between the US, Ukraine, and Russia this week, and then they're in Geneva. And no doubt there will be some plan, ridiculous plan, enunciated there with some sort of business deal looking really uneconomical or unrealistic between the US and Russia, some way to get the US to put more pressure on Ukraine to effectively capitulate in the medium to long term. Basically, is a synopsis of where these negotiations have gone. We've seen many plans delineated by the Trump administration, and whilst it isn't an immediate and complete capitulation of Ukraine to Russia, which is what Vladimir Putin really wants, it makes sense, it is a medium to long-term capitulation in the sense that Ukraine wouldn't be in a position to resist a future Russian invasion, which would either mean that it would succumb politically in the medium term, or Russia would just eventually, at a more opportune time, invade Ukraine again and basically do what they did in Chechnya, which is in the first Chechen wars in the 90s. Russia was effectively defeated, and they signed an agreement with the rebel authorities in Grozny, and then they came back in 1999, had the Second Chechen War, and had a complete victory, and then de facto reincorporated all of Chechnya back into the Russian Federation. So that would be basically the model they would use. Ukraine, if we look at the battlefield, not in a position where they would feel that they need to capitulate in any shape or form to Russia. We are looking at, we start the war, we count the clock as being in 2014. I guess it was, what date is today? We're about, about 10 days out from when the war actually began in 2014. So we come up on the 12th anniversary. And if we look at the second invasion, the extended invasion where most people start this war as having begun, then we're coming up on 4 complete years of that. And Russia still controls less than 20% of Ukrainian territory. That includes the 8% of Ukrainian territory that they controlled before the invasion in 2022. So they are still a long way away from their original goals in 2022, which was to demilitarize Ukraine, basically to end Kiev's independence from Moscow. Didn't necessarily mean that Putin felt he needed to completely annex all of Ukraine and control it and colonize it immediately, but definitely having a regime change and installing puppet government was a minimal strategic objective. And so far, what have they achieved? They have the land bridge from Russia de jure to Crimea, which is under occupation since 2014. And not much else. They have some destroyed towns and villages, and they have been largely depopulated. Maybe there's some general pensioners left there. They have looted as much as I guess they could take away easily from those regions. But in order to get any more value out of it, they'd have to make a lot of investments, and it would probably end up being, if you were trying to rebuild everything, it'd be hard to persuade people to move there as well, I guess. So it's not really much of a strategic accomplishment in terms of the original aims. And if you look at it now, if Russia were to say, to sign an armistice, Vladimir Putin would look in a situation where, okay, he's got a land bridge, but he'd already invested billions in building an actual physical bridge from Crimea to de jure Russia across the Kerch Strait. So yeah, they have that territory on either side, largely depopulated, largely destroyed. Still wouldn't be clear if they wouldn't face some sort of guerrilla war, low intensity probably in any case, even if there was an armistice, because you would have people there possibly who would even come back, who wouldn't be, because they own property there, who wouldn't be particularly happy about it being part of Russia. And you would have, at the moment, Vladimir Putin says he has over 700,000 troops in Ukraine. You'd have those men who, if you allowed them to be demobilized, they would come back to Russia. They're used to making about, we'll say, $2,000 a month, basically, which they, well, maybe they have to spend a certain amount on their own weapons and stuff, and jackets and helmets, because I'm not sure if they're actually all supplied by the Russian military, but let's assume they sent the 2,000 back to their families. If they were, like most of them are going to be probably lower middle class or a criminal class, because obviously they used a lot of prisoners as well in the invasion, but it's basically people who signed up in large part for money, the majority of them. Russia only mobilized 300,000 back in the autumn of 2022, and they had the original army, or people who had signed up for the military previously. But most people since 2023 who signed up for the Russian military are primarily motivated by money. The people who are ideological, they probably even signed up in 2014 as part of this Russian expansionism. So the vast majority of those, and guys who signed up in 2014 actually fought the entire time. Probably very few of them are actually alive just because of the rate of attrition. So most of the soldiers would be guys who raised their salaries quite considerably during this war. And then you're going to have a situation where if you allowed them to come back to Russia, they would be, if they're from a small town and they were something like a mechanic, we'll say, they were making what, $200 a month, $300 a month, as opposed to $2,000. Like, they're probably not going to be very happy getting 10, 20% of the salary. Russian economy is in a lot of trouble. Inflation is very high. Interest rates are high. The oil prices are low, so the ability of the state to generate revenues is problematic. Plus, they have all the sanctions, even though there's an armistice not taken off. It's still going to be in a very bad economic situation. They've kind of blown through their slush fund or any sort of cushion at this point. So you'd have a lot of traumatized men with a predilection for sadism and violence who have, at the moment, access to weapons. You'd also have to try and get all the weapons off them. and Russia being quite corrupt, it might be pretty hard to do in practice that they wouldn't be just able to steal a lot of those weapons. They're going to come back to Russia, and you're going to tell them they're going to work for whatever it happens to be, 10% of the salary, 20% of the salary. I know, let's be frank about it, a lot of those guys are just going to become either criminals or they're going to take one power for themselves, and they're not going to be very happy about going back and demobilizing into Russia. So Vladimir Putin has a huge problem if he tries to stop it from that point of view, which is his point of view, which is staying in power, because he won't have very much to show for it. He's going to love particularly violent and disaffected men coming back who will want power. And then you have an existing elite that's not going to want to share the now declining economic pie with any new, we'll say, elites that would be connected to this war. So there's just a recipe for Vladimir Putin losing power if he were to stop this fighting. So that is the backdrop, and why these negotiations are a complete waste of time, in my opinion, until there is a clear change in the situation on the battlefield. And Ukraine has the funding from the EU for at least another 2 years. And one thing that Ruby did say in his speech, that, or in the Q&A that was after the speech at the Munich Security Conference, is that they are now planning to stop selling Ukraine weapons, even if they don't supply any aid, and they don't, whether it's humanitarian, financial, or military. And the intelligence sharing that they do give to Ukraine, which is valuable, same with the arms sales, but not as essential as it would have been 2 years ago. They can plan to continue to give those. So it doesn't look really that likely that Ukraine would capitulate militarily, have some sort of calamity on the front lines. There's no evidence of that. Russia has been slowing down. The weather has been terrible anyways for making advancements in the last 2 or 3 months. And in fact, it's very unclear if Russia's really made any gains in the last 2 months. It seems like they claim they made gains, and then, as we saw in Kupinsk, as Zelensky goes about 2 weeks later and just starts shooting selfie videos on the edge of the town, which means, well, it's obviously not under Russian control if Zelensky can go there and do that and shoot a video there. And we've seen that play out many times. They've become a little bit of a propaganda battle with soldiers going forward and just raising flags and actually not being in control really anywhere. And that's another sign that Russia is running out of steam and it is close to culmination. They may have one last offensive when the weather improves, but this will probably be the last hurrah unless they make very difficult decisions internally in Russia, which would mean an actual mobilization again of soldiers. Then they can have more advancements. It doesn't look like China is going to give them enough aid, whether it's military or financial, for them to make a huge jump in terms of technology in the next, say, 6 months. So we're probably looking at the last offensive by Russia in this war, if that indeed even happens, unless they go to mobilization. Again, Vladimir Putin, if we judge what happened with the first mobilization in the autumn of 22, is not going to be very popular if he goes for another one. And that's probably why he will avoid doing that. And then he's got the huge problem, well, what does he do then? Because if he doesn't go for mobilization and goes for some sort of pause in the fighting, he would probably need to fight somewhere else. That could be to launch an attack, limited attack somewhere in the Baltic region, and try and seize maybe a town or two and demonstrate that he's managed to undermine Article 5. That would be a strategic victory for Vladimir Putin and Russia if he were able to achieve that. That's very risky, as we saw with the recent crisis over Greenland. NATO allies of the US were willing to at least state that they would give instructions or rules of engagement to fire on US troops. So can you imagine that they would just let Russia waltz into a town or two in Latvia or Estonia or somewhere and not actually respond? That would be a very big gamble by Vladimir Putin, but he may have just bad options in front of him in about, we'll say, 6 months' time. The real key thing for Ukraine was to be able to last until about April, especially with this winter and Russia really devastating a lot of Ukraine's energy infrastructure, in particular in the capital, Kyiv. The weather has changed in the last few weeks, so now it is a lot milder. So presumably going forward, Ukraine is probably out of the worst of that. And we will see in the coming weeks and months how all this develops. So not expecting to see a huge dramatic change in the next few months on the battlefield. Don't think either side is going to be able to make a huge breakthrough in that regard. All that favors Ukraine as the defender, because Russia is the one that needs to continue the war for regime security. And what I did see that was of particular interest during the week was Russia's decision to throttle, not completely block, but throttle Telegram, the messaging application, which allows, in particular, much of Russia's really only source of independent information on the war, which is the Z bloggers. So you have these military bloggers who are pro the war, but they're not part of the government apparatus in general. So they actually will criticize the Russian government as Russians because they want Russia to do way more horrific stuff and actually win and kill more Ukrainians and actually take over the country. So that is only probably the main source of dissent within Russia at the moment. It's symbolized by Girkin, who led the operations 2014 to take over Crimea, or played a central role in them, and also with the invasion of the Donbass in 2014. He sits in a Russian prison because he is an outspoken critic of Vladimir Putin. He has not met the same fate, so far at least, as Navalny. It was revealed that apparently Navalny was killed with some dart frog poison. But I think we can all safely assume that he was killed by the Russian state. But they haven't killed Girkin as yet, because he still has enough support in a key constituency that Vladimir Putin is presumably not willing to, well, he's willing to offend them, but definitely doesn't want to upset them too much. They might start revolting, and they would be a problematic threat to his hold on power. So the fact that they will block Telegram, which this community would need, for example, or would use in the case of opposing the fighting without a strategic victory. So say Vladimir Putin decides, okay, clearly I can't win this war now. We have some sort of deal where Putin believes that, okay, probably will win in the medium to long term. He preferred to win now. I think this deal that the US has come up with, and there's probably going to be some argument about the interpretation of it anyways, that it suits us to go for a pause in the fighting. At least we'll, from a Russian point of view, start to reconstitute the army. Then taking out Telegram, which would be a way that a lot of the critics are going to mobilize and actually communicate with the Russian public and with each other, would seem to be something that would be in Vladimir Putin's interests. They're not blocking Telegram because there's any real reason other than crushing dissent. Let's be frank about it. It's not because it's, you know, it's even run by Russian Pavel Durov, and he's pretty critical of the West anyways in general, from what I can see. It is a curious decision to make at this point in time. They could have blocked it long before, so why do it now? So there is a little bit of a possibility that Putin is trying to create a little bit of space where he may go for a pause in fighting for whatever reason that might be. It was my prediction at the start of the year. There was 50% likely that we would see a pause in fighting this year, not as into the war, but a pause in the fighting. Dramatically increasing if we go into 2027. I think it's like 80% likely, just because the Russian economy is in a lot of trouble. Anyways, that's my presentation for today. Ben says proliferation of Russian UAV skills to Africa cartels, TCOs, generally to the highest bidder will be a problem. Yes, they will export all that war knowledge to many parts of the world, and we will see a lot more conflict as a result, because people will feel that they have a lot to gain. We're also in a situation because the US is openly threatening, or has been up until a few weeks ago, to invade and change borders by force, that the respect for the principle of national sovereignty and national borders is very heavily undermined at the moment. If the US were to actually attempt to annex Greenland using force, then that would really probably be the end of acceptance of national borders just based on the principle. It would actually have to be enforced by force at that point. So you would see nuclear proliferation going wild across the globe, because nuclear weapons would be the best way to guarantee your borders. So we're not quite in that world, but we're not too far off of it. But yes, that's something that will happen. Ukraine will also do something pretty similar. They will be selling their know-how, and the defense industry here will be definitely one of the most up-to-date and cutting-edge, quite literally, post-war. It already is, basically, but obviously Ukraine and Russia both need to use a lot of that know-how and material for their own war at the moment. But you see, they go to arms fairs across the world, and they're basically selling their know-how and technology already, both of them. So that is something to expect post-war. And if you are planning to come here to Ukraine then and invest, then that's obviously an industry that is going to be quite lucrative. It already is at the moment, as I say on my lifestyle channel, businessmen I meet here in Ukraine are investing in agriculture, the defense industry, and real estate are the three main things at the moment. So same for Russia in terms of the defense industry. That will be, I guess, the silver lining that I'll have for having spent so much of their economy and lost so much treasure and personnel in this war, is that some people in the defense industry, not those who are in general slugging it out in the trenches, although they're not really using the trenches in that way anymore. Yeah, they will make a lot of money for a small number of people as a result. So I'll end it there because I'm going to have a lifestyle live stream later on today. I guess in principle I'm going to have it in about an hour and a half unless I change the timing, and hopefully that I don't have an issue with the electricity. My electricity went out for the first time in a month actually last night, so it came back on only this afternoon. So I will go ahead with that live stream. That is the plan, and you can follow up with some questions there. If you're interested in coming to Ukraine, I do have my guidebook down below, my insider's guide for coming to Ukraine during the war. There you'll get my hospitality guide as well as logistical and safety information and historical background to the country. That's probably one of the things that's of most value because it's not something you can get in GPT for sure, because I test all these things. And there you'll get my favorite cafes, bars, cocktail bars, and shisha lounges. Not too much clubbing going on in Ukraine nowadays outside of Zakarpattia, which is the region in the extreme west of Ukraine where there's no curfew. But if you are interested, I do have the few places that are open also there for the cities like Lviv, Odessa, Kyiv, Chernovtsi, and Uzhhorod. That's available for purchase down below in the link in the description to this live stream. So I will see you very soon on the other live stream on my main lifestyle channel, Connor Klein New Europe Experience, and I bid you a do pobачення, and as is written on this t-shirt, Slava Ukraini, do перемоги.